We are delighted today to have Dr. Peggy Bulger with us. She is an accomplished scholar in American folk life and its vibrant role in American culture. Dr. Bulger earned her baccalaureate degree in fine arts at the State University of New York at Albany and an MA in folk studies at Western Kentucky University. Her doctorate is in folklore and folklife from the University of Pennsylvania. Since May of 1999, she has been the director of the Folklife Center at the Library of Congress in Washington, where she directs policy development and implementation on the preservation of American folklife. Previous to that, she was senior program officer for the Southern Arts Foundation in Atlanta. In her busy schedule, she has found time to write 2 books and several articles on American folklife, and has produced or co-produced a number of television documentaries on Southern folklife for PBS. She has devoted many years of scholarship and personal endeavor to cultivating and preserving folklife in America, and we are honored and very pleased today to hear from Dr. Peggy Bulger.
Thank you all so much. I'm really pleased and honored to be here for the House of Learning lecture. I was a little intimidated by the title. I sometimes feel like I never have left that House of Learning, and I have more learning to do than anybody else here in this room. And before I begin, I wanted to say that I'm kind of like an old codger. Some of you will probably be very familiar with the American Folklife Center, and you will have heard some of the stories I'm going to tell, because you know how we are. We keep telling the same stories over and over. But I trust that some of you are not familiar with the American Folklife Center, and you won't have heard my stories before, and you'll laugh at them. So I am forging ahead with great faith here. Before I begin the slide portion of the talk, which, you have technology here that's, always makes me a little nervous, but I hope that I'll be able to manage the 2 buttons that I'm in charge of. Before I begin the slide portion of my talk, I want to begin by offering a story, a little fable, before we start our journey into the American Folklife Center's history. So if you would, I'd like you to listen to this little snippet. Does anybody recognize that old-time fiddler? Well, it is the distinguished senior senator from West Virginia, head of the Appropriations Committee and power broker par excellence on Capitol Hill. It is Robert C. Byrd. No matter if you agree or not with this grandee of the Senate, he's a force to be reckoned with. And if you work for the legislative branch of government like I do, he's a man to know and win over. Very fortuitously, the American Folklife Center holds over 12 hours of Senator Byrd's fiddling, which you just heard a little snippet of, him playing More Pretty Girls Than One there. And that was recorded back in 1977 by Alan Jabbour and Carl Fleischhauer. And Carl Fleischhauer actually spent some time here in Utah with the Paradise Valley project, which there's a case with photographs out there with Bert Wilson's photos, and he worked very closely with Carl. But I was in my office one day. I've been, as you heard, I've been in Washington not too long, a little less than 4 years. And this was back in 2001. I was in my office, and I got a call from Senator Byrd's personal secretary, and she says in her West Virginia drawl, "Dr. Bulger, Senator Byrd has your center did some recordings of him, and he has those recordings on reel tape. He can't play them anymore. He's wondering if he could get them on cassette." Well, would we? Of course. It was the height of the appropriations. It was the time in 2001 when we were actually asking for a doubling of the American Folklife Center's budget and 9 new positions. I was more than happy to make, you want CDs, no, they didn't want to go all the way to CDs yet, they wanted cassettes. So as I was making arrangements to have these copies made, I learned that Dr. James Billington, the Librarian of Congress, would accompany me to Senator Byrd's office personally. It was the height of the appropriations time. Let's make sure we know that. And he would make the presentation of these tapes personally. Now, some of you may know Dr. Billington, and if you do, you know he's a very distinguished scholar of Russian history and culture and politics. He's in his late 70s. He's about 6'4" with a shock of white hair. Has a very patrician bearing. He's a Princeton man, and he himself is a power broker on Capitol Hill. Senator Byrd, who's in his 80s, is short in stature. He's about 5'4", about my height, and he has an enormous personality, but an identical shock of white hair, just like Dr. Billington. And I like to think that in avian terms, I look at Dr. Billington as a tall, distinguished stork, while Senator Byrd would be a bantam rooster. And so with a meeting of these two men would be quite interesting, if nothing else. It would be memorable. Well, Dr. Billington was extraordinary in remembering all of the talking points I had prepared for him, and he engaged Senator Byrd in a discussion of the importance of old-time music and referenced Byrd's rendition of More Pretty Girls Than One as one of his favorites. Byrd and Billington participated in this lively discussion for over 30 minutes, which is quite long. Well, I looked on in really a degree of awe. I jumped in occasionally to extol the virtues of the American Folklife Center and how important music is to life, and how much our collections at the American Folklife Center meant to everyone in the nation. And we played portions of Byrd's tapes to his absolute delight. And then we had the obligatory photo op. And during all of this, Senator Byrd, this is quite typical on Capitol Hill, his staff, who is probably in their 20s, very young, they're all glued to C-SPAN watching what's going on the Senate floor, and he'd call out every once in a while, "I don't have to go out and vote yet, do I?" And they would let him know where we were on the voting so that he could get there. So as we rose to leave and we said our goodbyes, and Senator Byrd all of a sudden cried out, "Wait! You can't go yet, you have to see this." And he rummaged around in his very ornate senatorial desk and pulls out this really ratty-looking VHS tape, much played, pops it into the VCR, and lo and behold, comes up on the screen a much younger version of Robert C. Byrd with a shock of black hair, playing More Pretty Girls Than One. He was actually in overalls in the cornfield with Buck Owens. And he was singing, "You loved another and you were gone." Now, some of you are young enough, you may not know this, but this was classic 1970s TV hee-haw. And there it was. Robert C. Byrd and his string band were on hee-haw, and Senator Byrd had saved this tape for us to see. Well, I looked over at Dr. Billington, and as we say in the South, I lived in the South for quite a long time, he was slack-jawed. I realized Dr. Billington may never have seen hee-haw before, and this was just a little bit too much for one day. So, as we finally, 30 minutes later, got up to say our farewells, Dr. Billington and I walked off to the waiting town car, and he looked at me in some degree of still being in a daze, and he said, "That was the longest time I've ever been invited to spend with a member of Congress." Now, it may have been long for more reasons than one, but I knew that Dr. Billington had learned really the power of folklore, the power of traditional culture and music to move people and bring people of seemingly disparate backgrounds together. And more important for us, the potential for the American Folklife Center to be actually one of the greatest assets of the Library of Congress. And that hasn't always been the case. The American Folklife Center, for those of you who haven't ever been there, is located in the Library of Congress, which is really one of the most beautiful buildings and exciting institutions in the world. This organizational affiliation makes really good sense because the management of the Archive of Folk Culture, which comprises all of the collections of the center, which has, by the way, over 3 million items, entails the basic activities of acquisition, processing, preservation, and reference, which are carried out by our staff. But the center differs from other divisions in the Library of Congress in that it has its own board of trustees and a separate line item in the budget. In fact, the center was created by an act of Congress and placed at the Library of Congress in 1976, which was the year of the American Bicentennial. Now, there were a number of different forces that resulted in the creation of the center. There was an interest in the American history and culture stimulated by the U.S. Bicentennial. There was a growing understanding of and appreciation for American cultural diversity. And there was the success of the first Festival of American Folklife, which was held on the National Mall in 1967 and each year subsequently. And finally, there was the work of a small and dedicated group of advocates, including the intrepid folklorist and labor historian you see here, Dr. Archie Green, who literally walked the halls of Congress to lobby for the new center. The first drafts of the legislation for the center called for an American Folklife Foundation, which is very interesting because the reason why Archie had been walking the halls of Congress for all that time is because the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities had been created in the 1960s, and they were charged with really supporting the arts and culture of the American people. Well, there were about 10% of the people that were being served, and you know, I hate to say it, but we called it the SOB groups, symphony, opera, ballet. They weren't getting to 90% of the diversity out here and the culture and the arts that were being done in many of the communities around the country. And Archie and his advocates were trying to get a recognition that more money had to go to the grassroots people. So when this first draft of the legislation, which called for a foundation, it was really more like a third endowment, which would just fund traditional culture. Well, obviously there was great resistance to this idea on the Hill, as you can imagine. In part, there was a real concern that populist forces are going to influence Congress to divert funding from high culture to folk cultural projects and activities. So eventually, after much wrangling, the grant-giving function was removed from the draft legislation, but the two existing endowments were actually really charged with including folklife programming in their budgets, and as a result, the National Endowment for the Arts created a folk arts program in 1974. Well, the final hurdle for the legislation, eventually it was titled the American Folklife Preservation Act, was determining a location for the new center. Now, many who wanted to ensure the continuation of the Festival of American Folklife expected that the American Folklife Center would be placed in the Smithsonian, for the Smithsonian puts on the festival every year. But Dillon Ripley, who was secretary of the Smithsonian at that time, was very uneasy about the provision for a separate board of trustees. And as you know, the Smithsonian has a board of regents, and, you know, to his credit, I don't blame him. Having another board was not a piece of cake, but he declined to support the legislation, so it became necessary for congressional sponsors to look beyond the mall. Up the hill from the Smithsonian, behind the U.S. Capitol building, the Archive of American Folksong had been established in the music division of the Library of Congress since 1928. Thus, the library really had been in the business of documenting and preserving grassroots cultural traditions for over 50 years at this time. So it was equally a logical place for the new center. I love that picture. What a hunk. The first head of the Folk Archive was Robert Winslow Gordon. He believed that the American traditional music should have a place in the National Library. Gordon was a passionate collector who had set for himself just a little goal, a life goal, of collecting all of American folk songs, end quote. An enterprise he described, thank God, as a national project with many workers. So in the service of this idea, he carried a recording machine all the way from the Georgia Sea Islands to the wharves of San Francisco. He even took out advertisements in Adventure magazine and other publications, inviting readers to send in all the old songs of any variety. Unfortunately, he was a better collector than a bureaucrat, and he failed to keep the library officials properly informed of his whereabouts and his activities, and so after a few years, he was told that money for his privately funded position was no longer available. The next two heads of the folk archive were better known and more successful, John and Alan Lomax, and here's John Lomax in this photograph. Both Robert Gordon and John Lomax had been encouraged by their Harvard University department professors, English department professors, Francis James Child and George Lyman Kittredge. These two men encouraged Lomax to pursue his interest in folk music because, of course, by 1910, John Lomax had already published his collection of cowboy songs, which was really a groundbreaking work. Now, his son, Alan, in this photograph, and I don't know if any of you saw the Grammys on TV on Sunday, but Alan Lomax won a Lifetime Achievement Award, much overdue and well-deserved. I want to play for you a little snippet of a song that was collected by Alan Lomax on October 26, 1937, in Saylorsville, Kentucky, from old-time fiddler W.T. Stepp, and see if you recognize this tune. Anybody recognize the tune? Ah, isn't that interesting? This recording is called Bonapartes Retreat, but it's unique in that Bonapartes Retreat is an old-time fiddle tune that's usually played as a march. This is the only time we know of in recorded sound where this particular piece was played as an up-tempo reel. When Aaron Copland was searching for music for Agnes DeMille's 1942 ballet, Rodeo, he found this recording in the Archive of Folk Song and used it note for note. This was before we had a lot of the intellectual property issues we have now, in the hoedown section of that ballet. And obviously that's how many of us know it, but it's now also firmly in the American musical repertoire and can be heard on TV commercials under the slogan, "Beef, it's what's for dinner." We love to use this particular song to illustrate the fact that folk culture and high culture and pop culture are all they're just morphing together and feeding each other all the time, and there is no hierarchy, that they're all equally valuable, and we need to preserve all of this culture for the future. Between 1932 and 1942, John and Alan Lomax conducted collecting expeditions throughout the country, and particularly in the southern states. Sometimes they used a car provided by the library that was especially designed to accommodate the bulky recording machine, which the recording machine weighed about 200 pounds. It basically took up the whole back of that lovely little pre-SUV there. They also began an active program of bringing the collections of others to the library, and sometimes they loaned collectors recording equipment to conduct their documentation. One thing that they also did, which Alan Lomax did, which is really a remarkable little collection that we have at the library, it's called the Pearl Harbor Collection, is that on the day after Pearl Harbor, on December the 8th, 1941, the country obviously was in shock. Alan Lomax at the time was working on a radio project funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, and he had 12 folklorist friends out across the country who were also collecting for this particular project. He sent them a telegram on the day after Pearl Harbor saying, "Stop what you're doing, go out and collect man-on-the-street interviews about how people feel about Pearl Harbor and the declaration of war. Well, those tapes are now in our archive, and I have to tell you, they're incredibly powerful. And they're used by NPR, they're used by producers in many, many ways, and used by researchers. And I think it's a remarkable testament to Alan Lomax's foresight that he realized that these voices of everyday Americans would be very, very important to the future and to generations to come. Of course, what made possible all of this ethnographic documentation was the invention first of the Edison wax cylinder recording machine, which was in 1878. And actually, just this past week in New York, there was an event celebrating 125 years of the Edison wax cylinder. Well, celebrate anything, us archivists, you know. And subsequently, other recording technologies from disc to wire to tape. The first wax cylinder field recordings were made in 1890 by Jesse Walter Fuchs, documenting Passamaquoddy Indians in Maine, and these first field recordings also are in the collections of the American Folklife Center. In fact, the center houses the largest collection of American Indian music and dance to be found anywhere in the world. Because it was believed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that American Indian culture was really being lost, there were many efforts to document it. Collectors such as Frances Dinsmore, who you see here with Mountain Chief, Helen Roberts, Laura Bolton, and others worked for the Bureau of Ethnography and other organizations. And it's interesting that they're mostly women at that time who were doing the collecting. And these women made thousands of cylinder recordings, and in the 1940s, many of these found their way to the Library of Congress. The library currently holds over 10,000 wax cylinder recordings, and I have to say that on some of these, there's many of the original languages are not being spoken anymore, so it's really important that these cylinders have a home in the library, and they have been returned to the tribes of origin. In 1977, as one of its first projects, the American Folklife Center established the Federal Cylinder Project to transfer these sound recordings to preservation tape, catalog them, and make copies and return the copies to the tribal communities of origin. Of course, we are now embarked, as you can imagine, on a more recent preservation effort to digitize these recordings, and we'll hear more about that later. And we've had quite a little discussion over lunch about the merits or not of analog and digital, which will be, I think, a conversation that keeps coming up as we're really right now on the cusp of new technology that is changing so fast it's really hard to keep up. Two other areas of interest for folklorists in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were Anglo-American music because of our historic connections with the British Isles, and also African American music and lore, in part because of the strong oral tradition within the African American community. As a consequence of these early interests, the American Folklife Center collections are very rich in American Indian, African American, and Anglo-American traditional cultural documentation. Because the Folk Archive began life as the Archive of American Folk Song, it continues to be known as a repository for folk song, and listening to sound recordings made in the field continues to be a signature activity for researchers in the center's Folklife reading room. But the collections are now much more wide-ranging and international, and the name, of course, of our archive has been changed to the Archive of Folk Culture to reflect that breadth. Likewise, the word folklife suggests more than oral traditions. Like many of your own archives, the Archive of Folk Culture holds unpublished multi-format ethnographic collections that document a wide range of traditional culture. Sound recordings, photographs, field notes all help to preserve national heritage of songs and stories, of foodways, holiday customs and religious festivals, vernacular architecture, dance, occupational skill and lore, quilts, basketry, and other crafts. The congressional mandate of the American Folklife Center, as expressed in the 1976 legislation, is another little, it's almost as bad as Robert Winslow's Gordon charge. It's to preserve and present American folklife. Now, this is a pretty broad charge. So the center really carries out this mandate through programs of research and documentation, archival preservation, reference service, live performance, exhibitions, publications, and training. Our direction to preserve American folklife has a double implication. On the one hand, the Folklife Center has the daunting task of ensuring that the documentary materials in the Archive of Folk Culture, which, as I said, are over 3 million items at this moment, that they are properly sorted, arranged, described, housed, and stored, and that field recordings are transferred to preservation tape and now digitized, and that duplicate copies of fragile paper and original color slides are made as necessary. With collections that are donated, this is an enormous challenge at times. For instance, we just got a collection called the International Storytelling Collection, which is, we call it our 4-ton narrative. Literally, there was 4 tons of material that came to the loading dock one day, and it was the International Storytelling Collection, all of the documentation from the National Storytelling Festival out of Jonesboro, Tennessee for the past 30 years, plus many, many more tapes documenting traditional and professional storytellers over the last 30 years. It really is an enormously valuable collection showing the rise of the revival of storytelling and the use of storytelling in business and health and different walks of life. So as we get these collections, we really do have an enormous responsibility to make sure that these are preserved. But on the other hand, as you know, those of you who are folklorists, American folklife is preserved through field documentation. And so in the great tradition of Robert Gordon and John Lomax and other heads of the Folk Archive, the American Folklife Center has conducted many field documentation projects and cultural surveys in many cities, states, and regions. And as I mentioned before, one of those was the Paradise Valley project that was done right here in Utah, and you can see a exhibit of it out in the lobby. These projects have come about in various ways. Several were suggested by local organizations and agencies and implemented in cooperation with them. Others resulted from mandates from Congress, or they were joint efforts with the National Park Service. The Blue Ridge Parkway Folklife Project was conducted in cooperation with the National Park Service as a way of helping them understand and interpret the lives of people who live along the parkway. The relation between the land and the people living in a national park area has been a theme of a number of our center projects. The Blue Ridge Parkway collection includes documentation of quilting, foodways, religious practices, music making, and other aspects of domestic and community life. And it clearly demonstrates that the Parkway continues to be a vibrant community of people who absolutely are rooted in Appalachian folk culture. On the other hand, the Lowell Folklife Project in Massachusetts, conducted in cooperation again with the Park Service, examined the way that successive ethnic communities established identity within particular urban neighborhoods and spaces. And I don't know if any of you have been to Lowell, Massachusetts, but Lowell really was one of those old mill towns that was on decline. Downtown was dead. The mills had closed years before. Poverty was rampant. Urban poverty is especially debilitating, I think. Rural poverty is hard, but urban poverty, to me, is the worst. And with the Park Service, when they got possession of the old mills and really wanted